Welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. I'm Jack Wrobel, Vice President for the Forum. Before we begin our discussion tonight, I'd like to ask all of us to join into a moment of silence for the marathon bombing victims, their families, and the first responders. Thank you. Tonight we have an important but sensitive issue that's being talked about more and more across the country. The topic is, whose death is it? And should medication be prescribed to end life? As many of you already know, last November we in Massachusetts had a ballot question, and the voters were essentially divided. 48% of the voters were against dignity with death, as the law is called, and 46 were for it. Notably, 6% of the people declined to have an opinion. So a large portion were not ready to go yes or no on it. 7 counties in Massachusetts voted for it, and 7 counties voted against it. So again, Massachusetts is pretty split on the issue. Tonight we hope to enlighten you on some of the aspects of that. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to be talking about the subject, hopefully giving you some provocative thoughts, some things for you to think about. Hopefully you'll learn, and more importantly, you'll engage tonight. One of the unique things about the Ford Hall Forum, one of the things that we think is important, is for you, the audience, to come up to the microphones and to ask questions of the speakers. So as we're going through this tonight, be thinking about the questions. We do ask you to be respectful of the people behind you. That's code for keep them short, no speeches, okay? And also, we will be videotaping this session tonight, and in a couple of weeks it'll be on YouTube and iTunes for a free download. Remember that if you do decide to ask a question, you're giving Ford Hall Forum permission to record you and to also put it on YouTube and iTunes. Before we introduce the speakers, I just have a list of sponsors I'd like to recognize because we are very dependent upon our sponsors and our members. We have the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Barr Foundation, the Nellie Mae Foundation, and of course our partners at Suffolk University, which provided us a home for our executive director and for all of our facilities. We also especially like to thank our members whose generosity makes free forums available. And if you're not already a member, please stop by the information desk on your way out and sign up. It truly makes a difference for us. Tonight we have 2 very strong advocates who've been active in the public discussion for our issue tonight, Dr. Marcia Angell and Dr. Guy Maytal. Each will begin his conversation with about 5 minutes of comments, kind of setting the stage and establishing their respective positions. Then I will moderate a session, kind of a general discussion, asking them both some questions to kind of get the topic going. At that point, the important part of the evening, we'll turn the floor over to you, the audience, and for about half hour, 45 minutes, you'll be asked to come forth and ask questions and continue the conversation, to continue the discussion. At that point, I'd like Dr. Maytal and Dr. Angell to come forth and again kind of summarize with about 5 minutes of closing comments, and then we'll end the forum. Let me just start off by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Marcia Angell. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School. She is a former editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. A graduate of Boston University School of Medicine, she trained in both internal medicine and anatomic pathology, and is a board-certified pathologist. Dr. Angell is a member of the Association of American Physicians, the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, and is a master of the American College of Physicians and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Angell. We can give her a round of applause if you'd like.
Thank you, Jack. First of all, let me say that I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this program tonight, and I thank Fort Hall Forum for putting it on. As Jack said, last November, Massachusetts voters narrowly defeated a ballot referendum that would have given dying patients who find their suffering unbearable the choice of hastening an inevitable death if their doctors agree. The proposed law was virtually identical to the Death with Dignity law that's been in effect in Oregon for 15 years, in Washington State for 5 years, and is now before the Vermont legislature. The law applies only to adults with a life expectancy of less than 6 months and gives physicians the option of providing medication to bring about a faster, more peaceful death. Why is this law necessary? Because although good palliative care can provide adequate relief for the great majority of dying patients, it can't for all. Most pain can be eased, but other symptoms are harder to deal with. Weakness, loss of control of bodily functions, shortness of breath, nausea. Even worse, for many dying patients, is the existential suffering. They know their condition will worsen day by day until their deaths, that their course is inexorably downhill, and they find it meaningless as well as agonizing to have to soldier on. Over 15 years, the law has accounted for 673 deaths in Oregon, fewer than 1 in 500 deaths there. Most patients were suffering from widely disseminated cancer, and the prognosis was clear. Far from being disadvantaged, they were relatively affluent, well-educated, and well-insured, and nearly all were receiving hospice care, good palliative care. Nearly all died at home, where most people say that they would like to die, with their loved ones present. Of great importance, about a third of those who received medication didn't use it, but kept it at hand because it provided peace of mind. Now, no law works absolutely perfectly, but this one seems to come about as close as possible. A few key points. First, this is not a debate about life versus death. All of the patients will die soon. The debate is simply about the manner of death. That's why many people prefer the term physician-assisted dying to physician-assisted suicide, since this is not like the usual suicide in which someone with a normal life expectancy chooses death over life. Unfortunately, terminally ill patients don't have that choice. Second, the law does not require physicians to provide medication to patients who request it if they don't wish to do so. It simply provides one more choice for both physicians and patients as they deal with terminal illness. Third, the law requires referral for mental health evaluation only if a physician believes depression or another mental condition is impairing a patient's judgment. We need to remember that some depression is almost inevitable in dying patients, and the diagnostic criteria for depression in the American Psychiatric Association's manual overlap almost completely with the symptoms of terminal illness. Things like inability to sleep, rumination about death, loss of appetite. But studies from Oregon show that depression is no more common in patients who request assisted dying than in other terminally ill patients. And one recent study showed that those who obtained the medication were less depressed and anxious than those who didn't. Moreover, we don't know whether treatment would be effective in this context, since there have been no good clinical trials of psychiatric treatment for dying patients. The drug companies do their studies in young people who have no other illness. Arguments against the Death with Dignity Act seem to stem from the paternalistic notion that terminally ill patients can't be trusted to know what they want, that they need to be protected from themselves. The AMA believes that physician-assisted dying is, quote, inconsistent with the physician's role as healer, close quotes. But this isn't about physicians or their self-image. It's about patients, specifically patients for whom healing is no longer possible. Patients, not physicians, are the ones to say when their suffering has become intolerable, and individual physicians should be able to stand with them without fear of retribution. We give patients the right to hasten their deaths by refusing dialysis or mechanical ventilation. We should allow them to hasten their deaths in this way as well. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Dr. Guy Maytal, is an attending psychiatrist and director of Psychiatry Urgent Care Clinic at the Massachusetts General Hospital, as well as an instructor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He received his MD at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and completed internships, residency, and fellowship at Mass General Hospital. Dr. Maytal also completed a fellowship in psycho-oncology and psychosomatic medicine at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. He's been an active member of the MGH Optimum Care Committee since 2008 and cares for patients with cancer and life-threatening illnesses. Dr. Maytal.
Thank you, everyone. It really is a privilege to be able to speak with you and engage with you in this important conversation tonight. You know, and it's interesting. The question we're really struggling with is a pretty old one. Underneath this question is one of, is death something that happens to us, or is death something that we do? And it's actually a very, very old tension. You know, one of my favorite quotes from Hippocrates is that it says, "Cure sometimes, treat often, and comfort always." And this is messy. This is a messy, messy situation. You know, as Jack mentioned at the beginning, the state is divided pretty much down the middle about whether or not this is something that we want to have enacted as law. It involves emotions, values, narratives, and all of those change over time as our physical states change. There's conflict, there's loss, there's a lot of fear, and a lot of anxiety. And tonight I'll talk with you briefly, and I'm really excited to find out what you think and to engage with you. So I'll tell you what I do, who I am. I'm a psychiatrist at Mass General Hospital, as Jack said, and every day I engage with people in one form or another around this very question about people who want to kill themselves. People want to end their own life or hasten their own death. And some of them don't have terminal illness, and some of them do. And we talk and we engage, or I talk with other doctors about it and trained clinicians. And there is a lot of it's sadness and love and hope, and it is complicated. And you know, from my experience, from the thinking that I've done, it is to think that it is my task in some way to actively hasten someone's life is unethical. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how I thought about this. For a variety of reasons. First of all, it seems to me that physician-assisted suicide kind of short-circuits the whole notion of providing adequate palliative medicine, palliative care to people at the end of life, to dealing with the systems issues of what it is to be someone with a terminal illness. And my job as a physician is to do good for the person that I'm taking care of and to do good for the world in whatever way I construct that. And so in thinking about an act, particularly an act like this, I borrow from a thinker named Margaret Batten when she thinks about several questions to ask oneself as to how do you evaluate whether or not something like this is ethical, is worth actually doing. And she asked 5 questions. And I'll go through each of them in my thinking about them. So the first is, does the practice respect autonomy? Well, certainly this seems to, in that people can make requests and change their minds, except autonomy requires a certain amount of information at the beginning, a certain amount of understanding. You know, most people don't understand when they think of physician-assisted suicide. They don't understand, certainly as the law was enacted or was on the ballot here in Massachusetts, that your doctor wasn't with you. The doctor's sole role was to give you a prescription, and that you were then to go home, go to the pharmacy, pick it up, and take it by yourself at home. In Oregon, only 10% of deaths that involve this particular method are accompanied by any medical professional. And that there is no obligation to send you for any psychological evaluation. In fact, last year in Oregon, none of the 115 or so patients who requested physician-assisted suicide were sent for psychiatric evaluation. Given that the underlying rate of depression in the general population is about 10% or so at any given time, it seems kind of distressing. So the second question is, does it relieve suffering? It's not clear. It really isn't clear. Because one would imagine, right, when we think of physician-assisted suicide, we imagine that these are people in significant pain or having other physical symptoms. And the truth is that we can manage most physical symptoms very, very well. And that the suffering that most people report, either in Oregon and now in Washington State, is of a different sort. It's an existential suffering. The top 3 reasons by far that people request this is a fear of losing autonomy, a fear of a loss of dignity, and a fear of not being able to engage in activities that they were previously able to engage in. If really that's the reason, why treat a fear with a prescription? If it's an existential crisis, why am I giving you pills, even if you're not going to use them? Something about that seems disturbing. And it really misunderstands the whole notion of depression. You know, depression happens at about 30 to 50% of people with terminal cancer. And it is distinct from being sad. For people who've suffered depression, and statistically some of you have, it's very different from having a bad day. It's very different. It is total darkness. And the truth is there are good ways to distinguish between someone who's depressed and someone who's having a bad day, or someone who's very sad as a result of their illness. You know, I engage with people, we talk, we listen, we explore, we find meaning. Often is the lack of meaning or the lack of ability to allow others to care for you that leads people to great distress. And there are treatments that can help with depression, the very least of which is sitting and talking with someone and being with someone. And whether or not I'm going to give you a prescription to go home and kill yourself misses the complexity of relationship, the moment-by-moment decisions that people change their minds over time. And and for something so divisive, to have it be such a permanent answer seems distressing. Because there's so many meanings behind when someone says, I want to die, or please kill me. Please help me. You know, we see it all the time. Someone says, please kill me, and an hour later we're back in the room and they're playing with their grandchildren. So I think we have to be really cautious. The other thing that's really distressing to me is primary care doctors and oncologists, by far pretty much the only people who prescribe these medications in the states where the laws are, have no real skill or training in assessing whether depression, and certainly depression accompanied by thoughts of suicide, is actually treatable, is getting in the way of people making decisions. You know, if someone were to come without a terminal illness and they say to a primary care doctor, I'm going to kill myself, in a moment they'd be on the phone calling a psychiatrist. There's something interesting that happens when someone has a life-limiting illness. All of a sudden, we think that these people who are such good doctors but have no time. You know, I talked with a few primary care doctors around the election who were in favor of the ballot initiative, and straight up, to be a little bit glib about it, but very directly, they were saying, I'm in favor of it because I don't have time to talk with people. At least there's something I could do. So it's really distressing to me that's what I was saying before. There are systems issues involved that we seem to be short-circuiting. Perhaps at some point this might make sense, but certainly not now. And then the other part of the suffering that's questionable to me is the criteria is not suffering in the law as it was. The criteria was not suffering for being allowed to participate. The criteria was prognosis, 6 months. There's no metric of how much you're suffering. There's a metric of my ability to tell you how long you're going to live. And doctors are terrible at that. And in fact, each year in the states that do have this law enacted, there are people who live beyond 6 months with the prescription in hand unused. There's no other situation where as a doctor, I give you a prescription for something that really isn't a treatment and I'm not going to follow up with, that is so permanent, where my only intent is for you to die. And lastly, in terms of suffering, the law as enacted would not even address the people that we really kind of in our minds think it would. People who are severely demented or have Lou Gehrig's disease and can't take care of themselves in any way, because it has to be self-administered. It doesn't apply to anyone in hospitals, because in a hospital you don't take your own medicines. It's only for people who are at home. So people who are sort of at the extreme ends of their illness, who really do need care, it doesn't apply to. And the other part of this is that there's a certain myth that it's just between you and your doctor. It's like just you and me sitting in a room talking. And the truth is that the way medicine's practiced, it's vast numbers of people, teams of people who get together. And so it seems to me that what the top reason for doing this is because people are afraid of something. Don't treat fear with the prescription. The third question is, does it avoid doing something that's intrinsically wrong? I don't think it does. I have a hard time seeing the difference between an intrinsic act whose sole function is for me to end your life without anything else involved. And then the next question is, does it corrupt the integrity of the physician? And from my perspective, that's a yes. It truly does. My solemn vow is not to intentionally hurt people. It's kind of medical ethics 101. I'm not going to do something where the only reason I'm doing it is to kill you. Sorry, not to intentionally kill people. Sometimes we do hurt people for greater purposes. But our job is, to heal, to provide hope. There's kind of a paradox in palliative care. One of my jobs is I'm the liaison to the palliative care service at Mass General for psychiatry. You can heal to the moment of death. Healing doesn't stop just because we can't provide treatment to reverse your illness. So it's kind of funny. It's not a medical act. That's the other part of it. There's no diagnosis. There's no follow-up. According to the law here and the laws in Oregon, you don't follow up with people. Does it work? Does it not work? There are always horror stories of situations where the person took the medicines and it didn't work, or it took them a very long time to die. So even though the state was split, actually doctors are very much not split. Doctors are very, very much opposed to this. Nurses are very, very much opposed to this. During the election, basically every nursing medical organization in the state was opposed to it. There are also statewide organizations for people with disabilities who are opposed to it. And it's funny, it's kind of interesting that New England Journal of Medicine right now has an online poll of physicians where people can vote and say, are you in favor or are you opposed to physician-assisted suicide? Because there's a current article, just happens to be this week. It's kind of timely. As of today, 4,400 people have voted, 81% opposed it. So it's just an interesting thing. And it's strange, because as a psychiatrist, I spend my time talking with people about how to have their life have meaning in the face of the hopelessness of it. One of my mentors used to say, killing yourself is like putting your skeleton in another person's closet. It changes something. All of a sudden, some existential despair is okay to do something to treat, but other existential despair, that we can just let you kill yourself. And fundamentally, why is a 20-year-old different? Dr. Angell was mentioning there's a difference because these people know they have a terminal illness, they might die. We're all going to die. A few years ago, I took care of a woman who had metastatic breast cancer, and she was quite depressed, and she was worried about what would happen to her family when she would die, and she was thinking off and on about maybe doing something to hurt herself, and what would she do? And 2 weeks after my last visit with her, she died in a car accident. So there's a certain, I don't know what to say, hubris that you think you know how it's going to turn out, as opposed to, what can I do given what I've got? Is death something we do, or is death something that happens to us? This kind of sends a mixed message. You know, it's kind of a provocative statistic, I'm aware of it. But it's interesting that since 2000, suicide rates in Oregon have climbed steadily. It's now 35% higher than the national average, when they were going down in the mid-90s, early mid-90s. So, and the last question is, does this lead to a slippery slope? You know, people who are in favor of physician-assisted suicide will say, no, what are you talking about? There's no slippery slope. You can look in Oregon. It applies only to people who are wealthy, educated, men, and white, by the way, are the vast majority of the people who employ this. It doesn't lead to slippery slope. I don't know. I think it's something to be concerned about. And then if really it is, on the other hand, if it really is just for this narrow slice of society, given all of the other ethical constraints and burdens and corruptive influence on the integrity of physicians, why do that? And also there is a slippery slope in a different way. It does send a signal that suicide is okay in certain situations. And we really have to ask ourselves, is there any difference between giving someone a bottle of pills or a prescription for pills and giving them a loaded gun to take home, other than the mess you have to clean up afterwards? So, autonomy is not the only value here. And with this last sentence I'll finish. There are other values at stake beyond just what do I say for me. There's sort of the dignity of the experience other people have, professional ethics, social duty, the impact that you have on others. We're not alone. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Both of you have referred to Oregon in giving some of the results, but, and again, each question I'm going to ask, I would like comments. I mean, you don't have to, but I would appreciate comments from both of you. Can you give us kind of the background, what was going on in Oregon 15 years ago that led to what turned out, I believe, to be the first state in the union to have death with dignity? What caused this? What was going on? What was the discussion? Did it suddenly pop up? Was it something that had been going on for 10 years? Marcia, would you like to start?
Sure. There had already, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there had already been a move that began with the case of Karen Ann Quinlan in 1976 to permit people who wanted to have life-sustaining treatment withdrawn to do that. At the time of the Quinlan case, that just wasn't done. So we got to a point where that was accepted. It isn't even controversial anymore. And people began to say, well, what about people who don't happen to need some technology, but they're suffering just as much? And particularly, what about the terminally ill? So they did try to pass it by ballot initiatives in Washington State. I think they also tried it in California, and they were defeated. And then in Oregon, when they decided to do the same thing, they wanted to have many safeguards so that it would be more palatable to the public. And they did. I mean, it cannot be done impulsively. There has to be a 15-day waiting period, 2 oral requests, 2 written requests, a lot of documentation, prognosis attested to by 2 physicians, and so forth and so on. I won't go through all of the safeguards, but there are a lot of them. And so it did pass narrowly in 1994. It was stopped. And the federal government said it would be a violation of the Controlled Substances Act if any physicians participated in this. Then there were a bunch of court cases that eventually came to the U.S. Supreme Court that said that the state had the right to do that. In 1997, in an effort to get it repealed, it was put on the ballot again, and this time it passed overwhelmingly. I think in part because the Oregonians were a little angry that the federal government had tried to stop them from doing what they wanted to do. And so it was actually implemented then in 1998, and then eventually the same thing was passed in Washington, again with all of the same safeguards, and is being considered now in Vermont, as I said. So that's the background.
There's another aspect to the story. Yeah, I actually agree. I think it was Attorney General John Ashcroft at the time who stopped the law. The other aspect of the story is there's sort of a different political movement here, I think, that interfaces most prominently by what used to be called the Hemlock Society, which is sort of a political movement where people say that, I have a say over how I'm going to die, and I should be able to end my life when and how I choose. And so that also kind of met the stream of the desire for people to have their physicians help them to kill themselves at the end of life. The challenge is twofold. One is the novelty in it was it involved physicians. It's one thing to have the autonomy to do what you need to do to end your own life, if that's what you choose to do. That's actually not what we're talking about. What we're actually talking about was the role of the doctor in this situation. And so this was part of the novelty of physician-assisted suicide in Oregon, thinking that, it's somehow safer, but all of a sudden you involve someone who's got a sort of different ethical duty here, and that's what makes it controversial in a different way. I do agree that once 1997 came along, the Oregonians were ticked off that the government was going to tell them you can't do this, and that was it. But until that point, at some point, Derek Humphreys, who used to run what was called the Hemlock Society, he had a bestseller in the 1990s called Final Exit, which was a manual for different ways to kill yourself if you have terminal illness. So that's also part of the game. Yeah.
Yeah, you've both mentioned Washington, Vermont. I think there's something going on in Montana. So what else is going on across the United States? Right now we've got the Pacific Northwest is kind of forward. Mm-hmm. What about other states? What about Texas and Arkansas? Is there anything going on around the United States?
I don't think in those states. What I do think, and Dr. Maytal, is that how you pronounce
that's
it?
right.
Is
That's
that
right.
correct? He mentioned the article in the New England Journal of Medicine last week. It's dated April 11th. And it describes what is, to my knowledge, the first program to incorporate physician-assisted dying within an academic medical center. It's a report of the incorporation in a cancer consortium that is where the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle and the University of Washington have the outpatient cancer treatment. And they have incorporated that, and when a patient, and Washington does have a law that permits it, when a patient fulfills the criteria, then they will have somebody help that patient through the fairly onerous necessity to fill out forms and do everything just right. They'll help that patient through that. And so they give their report of what has happened. And among other things, they say that there were some physicians, many physicians, who were initially reluctant to participate, and they didn't have to, it was their choice, who then, as they saw it work, changed their mind and now do participate. They also conclude that this program shows that it's well accepted by both patients and clinicians in this academically affiliated cancer center. So this is the first such program that I'm aware of in an academic center, and I suspect that what we will see over time is this adopted as just a part of good medical practice, state by state and medical center by medical center?
All right.
So again, I don't think there's anything else happening nationwide. I think what's happening is, just as you said, those 3 states, something on the legislative agenda in Vermont, and I do have a concern that, having read the article, there's a certain misunderstanding. I really think a fundamental misunderstanding that people somehow are supposed to be depressed at the end of their life. That they're supposed to be depressed. And if someone says, I'm going to kill myself, I want to die, then we say, okay. And there are certain safeguards, but the glaring absences are those of really engaging with patients to uncover what is it that really has you want to die, and should we participate in that? And for me, it's deeply concerning that physicians are involved in this who really aren't trained, really don't have the time to talk to their patients and find out what's actually going on, such that they're coming and saying, you know what, I'm going to cut my life short. Because the truth is, in 1997, when this was enacted, palliative medicine was fairly spotty, fairly not well distributed, not widely available. And I think that focusing our attention on this continues to keep us from the attention that's needed on providing actually good end-of-life care for people. That includes something that hasn't been talked about and isn't talked about, how doctors aren't trained to have these conversations. We're just not trained, and that's really a deep concern for me. There was a study that came out that said, because now more and more patients are surveying their doctors. How did your doctor do? You get a rating, it goes online, there's actual data. That oncologists who gave the most inflated prognostic predictions got the highest survey results. And oncologists who gave the most realistic prognostic predictions gave the best survey results. And got the worst survey results. And we're not trained to come in and actually have conversations that have people begin to engage with what does it mean for this biological entity called my body to be really nearing the end of its run.
Could I make a few comments? Dr. Maytal often speaks as though this were just an impulsive desire to end your life, like a 25-year-old who breaks up with her boyfriend or something. A bad day, I think, as Dr. Maytal said. One thing I think we have to emphasize is that almost all of these patients in Oregon were getting good palliative care, which also includes some psychological support. And the other thing, Dr. Maytal said, well, only a minority of the patients who did use the Death with Dignity Act in Oregon had been referred to psychiatrists. But in fact, most of the requests are denied. Most of them are denied. And the physicians who deny the request, many of them say it was for that reason, that they were concerned about the mental health, the mental condition of the patient. So already you've winnowed it down to a minority of terminally ill people who want to end their lives, not for the hell of it, but because the suffering is unbearable. Other terminally ill patients may not experience that, but they're experiencing it, and they are the ones to make that judgment. Dr. Maytal referred to Margaret Batten, who is a proponent of physician-assisted dying, and she makes the point that doctors really have two essential ethical obligations. The one is to honor the right of their patients to self-determination, and the other is the obligation to do what they can to act compassionately to relieve suffering. She says that neither one of those alone would justify physician-assisted dying, But together, when you have both of those things together, that is, the patient wants it and the suffering is terrible, then that overrides every other consideration. Then it does justify it. The other couple of points I'd like to make. One, Dr. Maytal made a point that's often made, which is you can't predict for sure who will die in 2 months or 3 months or 6 months. And that's true. This is a statistical probability. This is an estimate. You can't. But you can know with virtual certainty that the patient has an incurable illness and is likely to die in a matter of some months. If you look at the Oregon experience, 673 deaths, 80% of them had metastatic cancer, widespread cancer. Most of the remainder had one of two conditions, either end-stage Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or end-stage emphysema. Now, these are not subtle diagnoses, and it's clear what the prognosis is, if not the exact timing. If you were to say to somebody who was suffering so much from one of these diseases that they were saying, please, please, let me die sooner rather than later, if you were to say to such a person, well, hey, congratulations, you might actually live a month longer than 6 months, would that make them relieved or happy? I don't think so. They have already said it's too much. Another point, the suicide rate in Oregon was mentioned. One of the things that ought to be on our radar screen now is that the suicide rate in western states is far higher than in eastern states, which probably has to do with the possession of firearms, maybe a libertarian streak, so that Wyoming and Montana and Alaska and
Nevada.
Some of them, what?
Nevada.
Have the highest suicide rates in the country. Oregon is among the lowest of the western states, but it's higher than the eastern states. They all are out there. Dr. Maytal also referred to fears of loss of autonomy, fears of inability to engage in life's pleasant activities, fear of loss of autonomy, and loss of dignity. Fear is not in the wording on the Oregon website. The Department of Health keeps very careful records of how it's used. Fear of pain is, but fear of these different kinds of suffering they're experiencing at that moment. So I just wanted to clarify a few of those.
Guy, yep.
Yeah, please. So
You two go back and forth. I'm just here to kind of keep it focused.
well, there.
Keep us nonviolent.
It is a very emotionally challenging topic. I mean, the one thing that Dr. Angell was pointing at just now in her example is it really underscores what I was getting at. You know, the example of a 25-year-old who impulsively does something after a breakup with a boyfriend. That's not depression. That's not what I'm talking about at all. You know, like depression is a persistent, debilitating syndrome that really saps people's ability to engage meaningfully with life. And that can happen at any time, at any age, and certainly one of the things that brings it on is significant losses. And absolutely, when people are going through life-limiting illness, they experience loss. As a physician, I ask myself, where am I to look from when someone presents in such a manner to me? And where I look from is, how can I engage them to make meaning of their experience? How can I engage with them to find comfort in what seems like intolerable suffering? And in that moment, in their experience is intolerable suffering. But it really does beg the question of, at any time does the solution here take a prescription to go home and kill yourself? To me, it's very, very troubling that becomes a solution at that point. And the other thing is, Well, I'll just stop there, actually. Raise your hands.
Again, I'm trying to set the context here. Okay, we've got, the western states looking at it. How did Massachusetts get involved? What led us in Massachusetts to suddenly find something on the ballot? What happened there?
Well, that's kind of interesting. I wrote an article about this, How to Die in Massachusetts, in the New York Review of Books. I think it was published in February, after the effort lost. And in it, I trace what happened leading up to it and some of the reasons that it was defeated. The beginning of it had to do with there were two organizations who were instrumental in Oregon and Washington and Montana, where it's also permitted, differently. It's permitted through a court decision and not through the legislature or a ballot initiative. But there are two organizations. One is Compassion and Choices, which is now headquartered in Denver, and the other is the Death with Dignity National Center, headquartered in Portland, Oregon. And they were very eager to have it passed in an eastern state, a more traditional eastern state, because then people wouldn't say, well, those crazy libertarians. So they thought Massachusetts would be a very good choice to do this because it's a very liberal state. And so then it was a long process to do this. First of all, they had to get 10 signatures with the law, which was identical to the Oregon law, and I was one of those signatories, and then take that to the Attorney General to say, yes, this is a bona fide law, these are bona fide people who want to do this. Then we had to get something like 80,000, 90,000, well, to make sure they were valid signatures, we got over 100,000 who said, yes, we want it on the ballot. And then it went to the Massachusetts legislature, which had the opportunity then to weigh in on it one way or the other, and they weren't going to touch it. So then we had to get another 12,000 signatures from a different set of people, and eventually, after all of this took about a year, it did get on the ballot in November. All of the polls showed overwhelming public favorability. The month before the vote, it was 64% in favor. This was question 2 on the ballot, compared with only 27% opposed. That favorability melted away in the last month or 6 weeks. And I think there were numerous reasons for that. One reason is that most people don't read ballot initiatives. They have a ballot and they have 3 questions. I think this was the 3 questions. And they go into their ballot booth and they say, okay, let's look at these 3 questions. And one of them says death at the top, and then it says yes, no. So to no. Also, the Boston Globe came out against it. This hurt us badly because the people who do think, oh my gosh, there's some ballot initiatives and I haven't read them, cut out the editorials and walk in with it, and they vote that way. So I think that ignorance hurt us a lot. The other thing that hurt us was the Catholic Church outspent us by about 5 to 1. And even though polls showed that Catholics were just as likely to favor this as non-Catholics, almost as likely. Same thing as birth control. Mm-hmm. The hierarchy was against it. And big bucks came in. And then the other thing is the very liberal aspect of this state, in a way that we never predicted, hurt us. Because Elizabeth Warren had this huge get out the vote campaign, very, very popular, and we thought we could just piggyback on her. She was a liberal, we were liberals. And so we misjudged that because her vote came from urban working class populations in inner cities, many of whom were very religious Catholics and opposed it on religious grounds. So they came out to vote for Elizabeth Warren because they were pro-union and liberal, but they were not in favor of this. They thought it was wrong. So the parts of the state that we carried tended to be the more affluent parts, except for Springfield. Everything west of Worcester we carried, which surprised me and surprised most of us. But you got the inner cities, and we lost that. So it was a very interesting political sort of story.
Guy, if I could just ask you to hold your comment. We'll just, okay, I'd like to turn the floor over to the audience and ask you to come forth to one of the two microphones and speak into the microphone so we get what your question is. Again, I would urge you to ask a question of the panel and not make speeches, but you certainly can make some prefatory remarks. While people are coming to the microphones, I'd like to ask Guy if you could just finish up with your
I'll give you a slightly different spin on why I think the initiative lost. I don't think it's fair to say that it lost largely because of ignorance. Doesn't really do credit to the voters of the state. And if people are, taking their cues from a left of center newspaper like the Boston Globe, it seems like a reasonable place to take your cue. It wasn't that the Boston Globe said physician-assisted suicide is wrong. It's actually the editorial talked about how it seemed to be mistimed, given how controversial it is, and the efforts should be made to enhance and improve end-of-life care rather than going to something as divisive as this. The other thing I think happened is there's a difference between the idea of physician-assisted suicide and the details of this particular bill. Mm-hmm. So the idea of it is appealing for a variety of reasons, alleviating suffering, having someone professional who's a medical profession comfort you at the last moments of your life, having this be easy in some way. And when the details of the ballot actually became more widely understood, people started to change their minds. I think that it's just the opposite, actually, of what Dr. Angell was saying. That's not simply ignorance. And there are people who obviously oppose it on religious grounds. I mean, people are allowed to oppose things on religious grounds. I'm also a liberal humanist doctor, right? I'm not here as a mouthpiece for a larger organization. And I have humanistic grounds for opposing it. So I think it was more than just people who were in favor of this initiative like to portray it as the Catholic Church opposed it, therefore it lost. I think it's much more complicated and nuanced a story than that.
Well,
yes, ma'am. Would you please step up to the microphone? And
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Does this do it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Whoops. Does it my nose. Actually, you spoke in part to a question I was going to raise. Was there ever a consideration of drawing up a different death with dignity bill, different from the model that had been adopted in Oregon and Washington? Because I was certainly aware of concerns, particularly among physicians who were involved in hospice and palliative care, about some of the provisions that seemed really quite onerous. The time frame, the length of time, the absence, the funny kind of paradox that you needed to get two physicians before, but when it actually came to the administration of the meds, the physicians weren't there. So I think it was problematic, not because the essential idea was problematic. Then I have one quick question. Can I sneak it in? And that is, it seems to me, at the time when the debate was going on prior to the actual election, there were statistics available about what in fact had happened in Oregon. And I was very struck, as I think a lot of people were, by the disparity between the numbers of people who went through the process, got medication, and never used it, which again, I think, speaks very, very strongly to the whole issue of autonomy, and that there should be a way of honoring that. That's not a question,
That's
is
not
it?
a question. I'm wondering if there's a. So we got the first question, but that was not a question.
Right.
Okay, great.
Okay,
Thanks.
that's it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Either of you would comment, answer it?
I don't. The question was there at any time thinking of presenting a different ballot? I don't know. I wasn't involved with that, so I don't know.
guess it really goes
No, not really. Because our feeling was that the Oregon law was the best balance between having enough safeguards to make it palatable, at least to a minority of physicians. And I should say there's never been a survey of Massachusetts physicians on this. The Mass Medical Society took a position, but there's never been a survey of Massachusetts physicians. But it was the best balance, we thought, between something that would be palatable to the public, who would be worried, and physicians, but at the same time, so it would have a lot of safeguards, but at the same time not have so many safeguards that really they would constitute an obstacle to actually using the law. I mean, there's no sense in having a law if it can't be used. So anything you do on this is going to involve that balance. And people can object to this law from both sides. Not enough safeguards, too many safeguards. And we thought it was the Goldilocks law. And the people in Oregon also think that. It's very popular in Oregon. So, you know, maybe we were wrong, maybe we were right. I still think it was probably the best thing to do.
Yes, ma'am, over here.
Hi. I want to thank you both for coming and speaking tonight. And my question is, well, I have, I guess, two questions. One, I understand that you said in most cases the patient gets a prescription and goes home and ends their life on their own. But is there the option of having the doctor present, or I don't know?
Absolutely, yes.
And so, yeah, that's what I thought. And the other question I had was more of a procedural legislative question. Would this ballot, given, I don't know, I could be wrong, but I think the vote was pretty close as far as for and against. It was like 51%, something like that. So I'm wondering if you're going to have that question on the ballot again in a future election, or just because it was such a close vote, or if and when.
It's illegal to put it back on the ballot for another 2 election cycles. And the reason for this law is that the state wants to discourage the same referendum from coming up again and again until people finally pass it out of fatigue. So you have to go for, 2 election cycles, which means 6 years. So now the attention is turning to Vermont. I was up there the day before yesterday testifying at their house. There are some political shenanigans going on up there, but it's quite favorable, and that would be through the legislature. Let's see, you had, the doctor, can the doctor be there? Of course the doctor can be there. The point is, what makes this such a good law is that it's up to the patient. And in the early years, the prescribing physician was usually present. As time went on, sometimes there would be a nurse, sometimes there would be another healthcare professional, sometimes there would be another physician who was not the prescribing physician. But increasingly, patients do it with their loved ones around them. And while I like my doctor, I don't love my doctor. And if I were going to be using the assisted dying law, if we had it, I would not invite him. So it's entirely up to the patient who they want to have around them, and they usually have family and friends.
There are a couple of concerns about that, actually, because, only, as Dr. Angell saying, most people don't have doctors there. Doctors aren't asking to be there either. It's part of only 10% of people who've used this law in Oregon have had medical professionals at the bedside. The concern is several-fold. One is, what if it doesn't go well? This is not foolproof. This is a medical intervention that I'm involved in as a prescribing physician, and I'm kind of saying, see you later. It's kind of shifts from a medical intervention to almost a social, political act. Rather than, if I'm prescribing a medicine, I want to make sure that I can manage side effects. If it's not working, I want to do something to intervene. Some people may take hours to die. Maybe they have respiratory disease. Maybe they vomit the pills. It's not so. I don't think it's so simple. And the other is that there's the challenge, at least the way it's practiced in Oregon, is that a very small number of physicians prescribe a very large proportion of the death with dignity prescriptions. About a third of the death with dignity prescriptions are prescribed by about a handful of docs. There is doctor shopping involved where people kind of go till they find someone. So it's not as if the person prescribing this is going to be someone that's been your family doctor for the past 20 years. There's no requirement that that's the case. This may be somebody who's known you for literally 2 weeks, because that's the requirement from your first to the second request. So that's also part of the concern with the way this law is formulated.
Marcia, do you want to comment on that?
No.
Okay, fine. Yes, sir.
My question is for Dr. Maytal. If there were a law to be enacted, or it was fact that a law was going to be put into place, how would you rewrite it? Because for me personally, while I agree with the idea, I actually disagree that I think there's fewer safeguards that I would feel comfortable with. So how would you rewrite it?
Well, I don't think it's something physicians should be involved in, to be really clear about it.
That who should be involved? I'm sorry.
I don't think the physician should be involved in prescribing medications to end life. So, the safeguards, there are kind of two questions. One is the particular ballot that was here, and then two is for me, the ethics of being involved, where the only reason I'm doing this overt act is to hasten someone's life. I think this would have been a much harder law to vote against, right? Which I'll answer it that backwards way. Much harder law to vote against if there had been some sort of required psychological evaluation, if there had been requirement for medical presence at the bedside. I think it would have had a much harder time, much easier time passing. But I wouldn't support a law that's on unethical grounds.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yes, I had a question concerning the referendum process and the attitude of the great and general court towards any plebiscite that's a third rail issue. What would happen with us if it had passed? So many things have just been tossed into the hopper, and the handle turned, and nothing happened. Shredded. They got shredded.
Oh, not this one.
No.
This was a binding referendum.
It was.
It would have been law, and then the regulations would have to have been written.
Now, what determines that?
I don't know legally what makes it binding and not a non-binding, just advisory. But I know that this one was
so it would
binding.
be every 4 years eligible, an eligible question to be resubmitted.
No, it couldn't be resubmitted until
2 election terms.
6 years.
Right, 6 years.
6
It'll
years.
be
6.
Yeah.
Six.
Thank you.
after 2.
I mean, part of the concern is, it's harder to. I think part of what would make something like this, because it's such a third rail issue, as you say, that when it's presented kind of fully formed to the electorate, and there's no time to debate how to formulate it. I think when all you have is an up or down vote, it's much harder. I think it's if you have a legislative process where people can come, as Dr. Angell mentioned, she just testified, there's a place for people to air their views. I think something gets formulated that's more reflective of the population that it's supposed to apply to.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentations. I think I'm in that group that you were describing early on in the vote who don't know the answer, and but I'm interested in the issues around it. So I have this question. At the moment, under the law, individuals can do a lot of things that will end their lives. You can decide not to eat. You can decide not to take any liquids. You can go to the local CVS and buy a big bottle of aspirin and go home and take the lot and die. So part of me is saying, so what is it that's different about this law? And of course, you've been talking about that. It involves a physician giving somebody a prescription that presumably they couldn't otherwise get. So it makes it a bit easier for them to actually carry out, as opposed to swallowing a whole bottle full of aspirins. But it's not. Is that a distinction with a difference, is my first question. And then the other part of this is, lots of times physicians and families make decisions that result in a patient's death. For example, when you've got somebody on life support and they look as if they're basically all right and they've got brain waves and they're on life support and so forth and so on. But then all of a sudden the brain waves stop. And then after a little while, the physicians get together and say, okay, we need to talk to the family and we need to ask them whether we take the person off life support. And quite often the family will say, yes, take them off life support. So in those circumstances, and I'm sure many, many others that you've probably been involved in, the physician does step forward and order things or does things to end life. Mm-hmm. And so once again, I'm saying here the physician is also stepping forward to end life in a slightly different circumstance. But is the distinction a distinction with a difference?
Yeah, great questions. Do you want to?
They are great questions.
Great questions. Thank you. Yeah, really great.
You say, couldn't the patient find some other way to do it himself or herself, other than involving the physician? The point here is to give somebody who is suffering unbearably from an incurable illness that will end his or her life inevitably within a few months, to give them the option of dying more peacefully and more quickly. And while they're still lucid, a lot of the people in Oregon talk about the desire to be fully present and say goodbye to their loved ones. Barbiturates, which is the drug that's used, does that. That's if you ever have surgery, they'll usually give you a barbiturate IV, major surgery, that will put you to sleep instantly and quite pleasantly. And then they give you the general anesthetic, and you wake up in the recovery room, and you don't even know the operation is over. So the barbiturates are a lot like that, except you don't wake up. This is a peaceful, quick death. Now, in some patients, it takes longer. And until 2010, they did get information from the families, as well as physicians, when physicians were present, to say, was there any problem? And there were about 3 cases out of hundreds where they woke up. They woke up maybe a day or 2 later, and then they died of the underlying disease. I think maybe 1 or 2 vomited. So it works very well. If you tried to down a load of aspirin, you would surely vomit. I mean, you would have a lot of problems. I can't think of any other substance that does what, I mean, there's no reason you want to punish these people, that does what they want and does it peacefully. That is what they want. Yes, they could stop eating and drinking, unpleasant, in order to make that, for most people, in order to make that tolerable, you would have to give them so many drugs that it would cloud their their awareness. And for many people, that's just not acceptable. So if you say the purpose then is to help these people have a quicker, more peaceful death, this is the way to do it. And you need doctors to write these prescriptions. Your other question, I'll talk to in my 5-minute summary at the end, but I agree with you, or the implication. I think it is a distinction without a difference, withdrawing life-sustaining treatment and doing this. But I'll say why later. But good questions.
Yeah, really great. Since I'm not going to be talking about that in my concluding statements, I will address it now. I think that intent matters. And I think that I'll use the second question you asked about, right? So withdrawing life-sustaining treatments as opposed to something where you go home and take and it's not a pill, right? It's a hefty, it's about 80 to 100 pills that you take.
Or dissolved in liquid.
Yeah.
It's
in the case that you described, for example, which is a reasonable case, it's actually the physiology in the moment that has the patient die. The doctors aren't killing the patient. The physiology has gotten to the point where the patient stops. Patient stopped. In this case, there's something, when I'm with a patient and the patient says, kill me, but they're not actively dying, right? There's a distinction between having a life-limiting illness and actively dying. That is I'll use this word, it's a sacred moment, because it's kind of like, am I going to kill you? Is that my job? It's actually not my job as a physician, as opposed to, your heart stopped, your lungs don't work, the only thing that's keeping you alive is N-star, right? The electricity going through the machines. You're done, actually, and that's a very different phenomenology. As to regards to the first question, it really begs the question: what is the job of a physician in caring for someone? Because there are lots of ways to alleviate suffering, and from my perspective as a doctor who works with people who are struggling with this question, this is complicated. It's not a one-time thing. It's a process. People change their minds. People back out. People say yes. People say no. They think about what my grandchildren will think. Is it okay that for me the grandpa killed himself? Is it not okay? What story? It's really complicated. And the question is, when I'm involved as a physician, see, if you were to go out and do something to hurt yourself, which unfortunately people do on a regular basis, they're not obligating a caregiver in that act. I think there's a fundamental difference when you say, please participate with me. It's actually kind of why Dr. Kevorkian was convicted, right? Because he participated with them in a certain way. Not in this way, right? Because that's euthanasia. That's my action directly, like I'm actually injecting you with something. This is not that. This is, I'm going to give you something, then you're going to do an act, and it's kind of backing away from that. But either way, I'm involved. And I think that's the fundamental difference that you're talking about. And the other side of this is, people are suffering, but the question is, what are they suffering from, and what's my job in alleviating that suffering? There are people come to us asking for things all the time that we don't do as doctors. Not because they might not make a difference in that moment, but because we say, as a physician, I'm not going to do that given my code of behavior. People come and ask me for all sorts of controlled substances on a regular basis as a psychiatrist. And I say no, because I don't think that's not for me to do. And we talk about why, and we find other ways. So that's how I'll address that concern. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to limit the questions to just the 3 people that are standing. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank you all for the wonderful and impressive presentations. I have a question to Dr. Angell. So if physician-assisted suicide to be legalized in Massachusetts, then to what extent do you think it should be administered? In other words, what should be the criteria for determining whether the patient needs like physician-assisted suicide or not?
Well, first of all, I think it would be very rare, as it is in Oregon, because, as I said, palliative care can make the remaining life for a dying patient tolerable. So it'd be very few people. And I think that the important criteria are that the patient has an incurable illness and that death is likely within 6 months. Once those criteria have been established and there's no evidence that the patient's judgment is impaired, then to me, this is a matter for the patient to decide and no one else. When Dr. Maytal talks, in my opening statement, I said, this is not about doctors, this is about patients. And I would like to take Dr. Maytal back to that. It's the patient's decision. And by definition, and I agree with one of the safeguards in the law, which is a patient must be an adult and must be fully capable of making his or her own decisions at that time. It can't be done by a proxy. Then it's the patient. It's the patient who says, I am suffering too much. I want to end this. And who can second guess that?
So you think it should be the patient who should decide whether like he or she wants to die or not?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Since we're here at the Suffolk Law School, I thought I would ask a question that had something to do with law. So here's the situation. Yeah.
You're not not a lawyer.
No, that's all right. Because so the situation is we have a terminal ill, desperately ill person who will die within 6 months. That's the prognosis. And this person goes down to the Boylston T-stop and throws himself in front of a train and commits suicide. This is against the law, is it not?
No, not at all.
No.
That was my question.
No.
In terms of insurance policies?
I don't know. I
No.
think that there are many laws that say that you can't discriminate against somebody because of the method of death. But I don't know whether Massachusetts has such a law.
I don't know either. Sorry.
And if this law were to pass, would it then become legal for such a person to commit suicide?
I don't know that it's illegal.
It's not illegal in Massachusetts.
No.
To commit suicide?
No. No.
That was my question. I thank you very
Thank
much.
you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Maytal mentioned the statewide resistance of people with disabilities to the ballot question. And my name is John Kelly, and my colleague Michael Mewey and I are from the group Second Thoughts, and we were a group of disability rights activists who voted who argued on progressive principles against assisted suicide using progressive social justice principles. And Dr. Angell referred to the voters who really sank the bill as basically people of color living in cities. And I'd like to ask the doctors, why is it that upwards of 98% of the participants in the program out in Oregon and Washington have been white? And if these features of having a terminal diagnosis are ubiquitous, are part of having a terminal diagnosis, why are only white people using the program?
There are very few African Americans in Oregon. And I don't believe I said anything about African Americans voting against it. I said inner city, working class people, but I don't think I said anything about their race.
Guy, do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I think that's part of the issue in Oregon. I can't speak to what Dr. Angell was saying is that when you look at, there actually have been studies about what are the personality characteristics of the people who take advantage of it. And overwhelmingly, these are people, and mostly men actually, who have personalities that are very much invested in being in control. And it's pretty characteristic across the board that it's more nuanced than that, but people are in control, people have run things their whole lives, and this is one more thing that they're going to run. And no one's going to tell them how and when they're going to go out. They're going to do it. And from my point of view, right, as a psychiatrist, I can respect that perspective, but I also wonder, and it really is, somebody say I wonder like I'm about to say something as if I do, but I really do wonder, right? I really do wonder if these particular personality styles, this particular personality style has its own limitation, which is the inability to be contributed to, the inability to be cared for, as opposed to always need to be in control, the inability to connect in that way, and the contribution that it is to allow others to care for you, even when you can't care for yourself. So,
I think that's probably right, but that's the way these people are. Incidentally, it's 50-50 women right now,
Nice
so
to be
we have
corrected.
some controlling women
Okay,
too.
Good.
Dr. Angell, would you make some concluding remarks?
Sure.
You can go to the podium, or you can stay there,
I
whatever's
will
more
go
comfortable.
to the podium. I trained in medicine in the late 1960s. Extending life was the overriding ethical imperative then, extending life as long as you possibly could. And it was unthinkable that a physician would limit a patient's life-sustaining treatment. To remove a ventilator or stop dialysis or antibiotics would have been considered tantamount to murder, even if there was no chance of restoring the patient to anything like a normal life. That was the way it was then. All that began to change in 1976 with the case of Karen Ann Quinlan. Quinlan was a young woman who was in a permanent coma as a result of an accidental overdose of drugs. After it became clear that she would never regain consciousness, her father, who was named her guardian, asked to have the ventilator removed. The hospital refused, so he had to go to court. And eventually, the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled in his favor. The case became widely known throughout the country and was the subject of enormous controversy. Those of you over a certain age, and I think there are very few here now, will remember that. It was a subject at every dinner party. Her face was on the cover of every magazine. It was a big deal in 1977. Within 6 months, California passed the first of the state natural death acts, which essentially gave immunity to physicians who withheld life-sustaining treatment in accord with the terms of what was then called a living will. Other states rapidly followed suit, and in 1990, the U.S. Congress enacted the Patient Self-Determination Act that stipulates that hospitals that receive federal funding, and that's just about all of them, must inform patients of their right to refuse any treatment for any reason, and to appoint a proxy to make such decisions for them if they can no longer do so. So in just 14 years, from the 1976 case of Karen Ann Quinlan to the 1990 Patient Self-Determination Act, something that was once considered totally unacceptable became the law of the land, no longer a matter of much discussion, let alone controversy. Thus, dying patients who cannot live without some technology, such as a ventilator, may simply refuse it, or their proxies may refuse it, and their physicians must comply. and administer enough morphine or other drug to ease death. Probably most hospital deaths now occur after such a decision to stop the life-sustaining treatment. And it's striking how few safeguards there are compared with the many safeguards in the law permitting physician-assisted dying in Oregon. For example, the physician-assisted dying law, you can't do it through a proxy. But being taken off a ventilator, yes, that can happen through a proxy. Yet refusing a ventilator leads to death just as surely. Now, Dr. Maytal said something about, well, it's just a physiology. Well, imagine that somebody off the street came in and pulled the plug on your ventilator and you died. He would be on trial for homicide. And good luck on saying it was just the physiology. So the intention is to end life when you take somebody off the ventilator. So what about dying patients who happen not to require some medical technology to live? For example, a patient dying of lung cancer may have to be on a ventilator to survive even one day. But another patient, say one with metastatic cancer of the pancreas or breast cancer, might be suffering just as much, just as near death, but not need a ventilator or any other technology to live the next day. Should that patient have to die slowly, in misery, while the lung cancer patient has a way out? Efforts to legalize physician-assisted dying arose to deal with this disparity. That is, the suffering of terminally ill patients who are not on treatment that can be withdrawn to bring about an immediate and peaceful death. The movement to legalize physician-assisted dying, it seems to me, is where the movement to permit withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment was in about 1980. I think that's where we are now. That is, it's controversial and even shocking to some people, but gradually it will become accepted as part of good medicine because it's both compassionate and respectful of patients' autonomy. There's a report, as I said earlier, in the New England Journal of Medicine just last week that describes the incorporation of physician-assisted dying as an option in a major cancer center affiliated with the University of Washington, and concludes that it's well accepted by both patients and clinicians. I really believe that this is the story of physician-assisted dying. Gradual acceptance, one state at a time, one institution at a time. The title of this session, of the Ford Hall Forum session, was Whose Choice is Death? Well, obviously we all die, and that's nature's choice, not ours. But when someone is in the process of dying a slow, miserable death, he or she should have the right to choose the manner of dying. I can't imagine why anyone would want to deny someone that most personal of choices. These patients are adults, not children, and there's no reason to treat them like children just because they're relatively helpless. Simply put, it's no one else's business.
This is tough stuff, particularly this week of all weeks. I mean, death is very present for all of us. And at the same time, the remarkable fact is that when you strip away all of the superficialities, what people really want to do is connect and contribute to one another. And we have a phenomenal set of medical institutions in our city, in our state, and they do many things very, very well, especially when it comes time to acute interventions. And they do some things very well when it comes time to palliative medicine. where it's available, palliative medicine provides extraordinary alleviation of suffering, of pain, of nausea, of shortness of breath. People are cared for, both their families, themselves, in the hospital, at home. Cure sometimes, treat always. Cure sometimes, treat often, and comfort always, as Hippocrates said. The real challenge is that this end-of-life care, this good palliative care, is not universally available and not universally accepted even. Often when people are told the word hospice, they say no thank you. And physicians are just, as I mentioned earlier, physicians are just as culpable at times of not being trained in having the appropriate conversations with people, to actually engage in the process of what it is to have your life come to a close. It really isn't an act. It is a process, a series of hundreds, if not thousands, of moments and decisions, conversations, relationships, engagements, day after day, minute after minute, involving emotions, involving thinking, involving feeling. And the truth is, we don't really have any say or knowledge of when we'll die. All we know is we're alive now. Dr. Angell was saying, whose choice is it? It's nature's choice. It's a biological imperative. At the same time, getting sick is extremely challenging. Everybody here knows this. Assuming you have health insurance, in this state we're lucky most people do, and assuming you're at an institution with integrated services, as certainly in this town many are, but once you leave Route 128, it becomes harder to find. You still have to navigate appointments, bizarre insurance bills, multiple providers, different doctors giving you advice. There's a loss of function. There's a loss of role. People who were once caretakers their whole lives now have to receive care. People worry about being burdens on their loved ones, both physical as well as financial. People are put in understaffed institutions like nursing homes. Physicians are often really bad communicators and we often provide many services that patients actually don't need at the end of life, because it's easier to do something than to back off and do nothing, or provide comfort as opposed to provide an intervention that is more aggressive. And this is where our attention needs to be on. I think that the notion of physician-assisted suicide is a distraction in actually many senses. Our attention needs to be on symptom management, on communication skills, on educating our society that, this thing called my body is not like this thing called my car that can be fixed ad infinitum. That there actually is a point where it can't, and where a shift of perspective is required. Where control till the very end is not possible in the sense that we've had control up to this point. We don't start that way, and we don't end that way. We're connected to each other, and our choices that we make about our bodies and our lives have an impact on those around us. And I believe that life, is a gift to be treasured and explored in all of its manifestations. Some are pleasant, some are not, but all are human, including fear and worry, and all can be healed in a caring relationship. And that's what I believe medicine is for, not simply specific interventions. Our job is to comfort and to provide hope, even if it's short in its duration. Our job is to stand for that sacred space of healing that exists between doctors and nurses, patients and families. And we must always listen to patients' requests for a hastened death, but never act on them. Thank you.
Thanks for participating tonight. We intended to provoke you with our public discussion of physician-assisted suicide, and we certainly hope we were successful. The next Ford Hall Forum event will be Friday, April 26th, our annual First Amendment Award. This year we're honoring Barney Frank, who is certainly a strong advocate for free speech and certainly a practitioner of such. It'll be at the Suffolk University Walsh Theater beginning at 6:30. If any of you would like to honor Barney in our pre-event reception, we have some details outside. The reception begins about 5 o'clock. Thank you very much again. We appreciate you coming tonight and helping us be successful.